Hello, welcome to our show, coming to you from London. What's driving people in Europe to vote for some of the hardline right-wing parties there? What underlying factors are shaping the way societies there are moving? Well, far-right parties such as the British National Party and similar groups in the Netherlands and Austria have won seats in the European Parliament, and the biggest winners across the continent was the centre-right. Still, it's not that clear-cut because some traditionally left-wing groups, such as the Green parties, saw an increase in support as well. So today we ask, were Europe's election results a protest vote over failed economic policies, or were they fueled by other factors such as concern over rising immigration, especially from Muslim countries? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com/AJE, enter the chat room and take part. And of course, we also welcome your phone calls on the show. Examining the issues at stake today, I have with me two guests. From The Hague is Frans Timmermans, the Dutch Minister for European Affairs and a former MP for the Dutch Labour Party. And here in London is Crispin Blunt, a member of the Conservative Party in the British Parliament. As Shadow Home Affairs Minister, he has a special responsibility for security and counter-terrorism issues. Gentlemen, I welcome you to the show. And Mr. Timmermans, if I could start with you, sir, and ask, to some degree, we're sort of talking about this issue as if it's something that should concern everyone, that the right is, or at least the hard right is gaining ground. Is it something that that you think is of concern, or is it just a natural shift in power cycles, considering the left has had power for a while?
Well, I think to some degree, of course, the left has had power for a while, but what we're seeing now, this phenomenon of the extreme right, is very worrisome indeed. And I believe that the most powerful political force in Europe today is fear. You can win elections by playing on fear. And fear is linked with economic insecurities, with cultural insecurities, immigration insecurities, all sorts of insecurities linked with all the changes that have arrived to European society.
How is that, Mr. Timmermans, how is that manifesting itself in your country, for example? How are you seeing the change in your society?
Well, this society has changed very rapidly since the 1970s. If you look at our major cities today, half of the population, more or less, are of immigrant descent. This means that to many traditional inhabitants of those cities, their environment has changed radically. They don't understand their neighbours, they don't see what's happening in the streets anymore, and it takes time for people to adapt to this. Now, if people were optimistic about the future, you could deal with it, but this is the first generation since the Second World War that is not optimistic about the future, that believes that we've reached the pinnacle and it's all downhill from here.
Well, Crispin Blunt, good to have you with us as well, sir. Now, I wonder what sort of message you believe the voting public was sending out during the recent European parliamentary elections. What did British voters indicate?
Well, we're not quite as far down the track, I think, as they are in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands and Austrian places, the far right were getting 16–17% of the vote. In the UK, the BNP got about 6.9, just under 7% of the vote, and they only peaked at about the 17% level in about 20 particular districts in the UK, where their appeal to white working class voters manifested itself. And so there is the possibility that, of course, this trend could continue and we could begin to see support rising for that. But there is a very strong unity of purpose amongst the mainstream parties to try and see the BNP off.
What is your biggest concern as far as the BNP having this kind of show of support?
Well, some of it is to do with the white working class in the areas where they did poll as heavily as 18%, just feeling disenfranchised, disempowered, and so they've seen their complaints about that they've come to the back of the queue for housing, and they've seen immigrant communities in their estimation getting better treatment than they have, and that's then been used by BNP leaders quite ruthlessly then to play on the fears. But I don't think we're quite yet in the position of fear as a guiding factor, perhaps as much as they are in the Netherlands. And then also at the same time, we've got this collapse in confidence in the governing Labour Party, and of course the Labour Party it's often would have been the traditional repository of white working class votes.
Mr. Timmermans, to what degree do you feel these elections indicated that racism, perhaps Islamophobia, was pretty much on the rise?
Well, it's phobia in many, many forms, and one of the forms is Islamophobia. You know, if you look at a society like the Dutch society, where traditionally you would leave other groups alone to their own faiths and their own culture, etc. Many people in the Netherlands believe that Muslims would come here and take away the rights of the people who lived here before to exercise their own religion, etc. Now, of course, this is not true and exaggerated, but it falls on good ground because people are afraid for their future. They see their jobs leaving, they see all sorts of securities they used to have flying out the window, and of course the newcomer often then gets the blame.
Now, of course, the voter turnouts have been decreasing over the years, Mr. Timmermans, and I wonder to what degree the lower voter turnout, the exceptionally lower voter turnout this time, might have actually favoured sort of some of the fringe groups.
Well, that's difficult to say. I wouldn't put my money on that. Low voter participation is a result of the fact that European Parliament is far away from people. People don't understand the way it functions. They don't understand what happens with their vote. But traditionally in the Netherlands, people would say a low turnout is good for the traditional parties because their voters would be more inclined to vote anyway. But now we had a really good showing of new voters and very radical voters. So I don't think the turnout has much to do with this.
I wonder, Mr. Blunt, if you see that sort of signs of Islamophobia coming up. Of course, in Britain, some of the Muslim communities are quite isolated. And I wonder, considering what's happened in the past with riots on the streets and so on, that had any bearing on it?
It's the BNP is certainly now trying to play the Islamic hatred card very strongly, and but it's been a rather more recent quality that they've been putting forward and trying to see that as a key way of leveraging more support. And at the same time, there is an ongoing debate about how we engage with Islamic communities in the UK, particularly in the area I'm responsible for, which is counter-terrorism. There's a strategy in the UK called Prevent, which is trying to get into the Islamic communities, and we're presented with this difficulty of how do you address Islamists who are not committed to violence, but are committed to a set of values that are antithetical to the basic tenets of a liberal democracy, and we're wrestling with how to achieve that. And the BNP are trying to play on some of the contradictions that then come out of that.
How would you propose Britain balance the freedom of expression with obviously the need to integrate? In many cases, the issue of the hijab, the headscarf, of course, comes up. How would you suggest there's some kind of balance?
Well, we have a number of distinct British Muslim communities. If one looks at the British Arab community, it's actually pretty well integrated, and you don't see the Islamists really operating strongly in that community. But the British Pakistani community, which has a different background and a very different socio-economic setup, given the people who came from Pakistan to the UK, particularly in the 1950s and 60s, came from poor areas of Pakistan, not very well educated people, and that community has tended to continue to dilute itself by always going back to Pakistan to find a new spouse. And so therefore the challenge of integration has been that much greater for each new generation, only being half as integrated as perhaps other communities, immigrant communities into the UK, added to the fact then of it being a poor, initially poorly educated community, and so you've then got all these trends then coming together to increase their isolation, particularly in the northern towns in the United Kingdom.
Mr. Timmermans, I wonder with the issue of, for example, the hijab and the various practices that some of the communities have demanded, whether or not Islam is seen as challenging the European identity, as some have put forward. Can there be a system, some kind of a mechanism that allows a greater social harmony, but allows freedom of expression?
Well, the funny thing is, you know, people with my working class background took 3 generations to be where I am now with a university degree. With Turkish and Moroccan communities, you see that people can reach university education within 1 generation, which is a spectacular success. On the other hand, we also have small parts of those communities, especially with the Moroccans, that cause great trouble in crime in inner cities. And we need to target those groups more specifically. And we also need to be more aware of the tremendous successes by our new communities in our society. The fundamental problem here is that integration and assimilation are not distinguished enough in Dutch society. People believe that to integrate, you need to give up your culture, your identity. Now that's when you get into trouble, because you can never ask people to give up their identity. You can only ask them to change their behavior if you think it's not suitable.
Ms. Timmermans, to what degree does it become problematic when you encounter incidents such as obviously the Danish cartoon controversy, other issues come up, the teddy bear in Sudan, when there's a lot of media coverage of this? How do you think it affects the psyche of the society when they see these kind of flashpoints arise?
Well, you know, in Dutch society you really touch an open nerve, because this country was formed around the concept of freedom. And if traditional Dutch people believe that Islam is preventing them to be free in terms of what they say and what they think, they will react very, very strongly. And this is what we've seen. So there's a lack of understanding that you can hurt somebody's feelings and that you should be more careful about this. Instead of being more careful about other people's feelings, once the Dutch believe that their rights are trampled upon, they will be more forceful in being in their expressions, and that will certainly not help.
Right. Well, gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to stand by because we have to take a short break now. As we pause, let me remind you, you can join the conversation with your questions and comments by logging on to livestation.com and entering the chat room. You can see there's a debate taking place in there right now. We'll be right back.